I Want to Believe, section. Flying Saucers, the Process of Matter and Energy, Science, the Revolutionary and Working Class Struggle, and the Socialist Future of Mankind. Sometime in the mid-60s, SWP Representative Peter Camejo attended a labor conference in Brazil. The Posadist Partido Operario Revolucionario was a major presence in the room, its militants active in the unions of several key industries, universities, the military, and peasant struggles. He recalled them sitting strangely motionless before the meeting began, not touching the cups of coffee served to them or talking with others. Quote, and then Posadists came into the room, sat down, and picked up his coffee. All the Posadists in unison picked up their cups as well and started drinking. End quote. Their behavior was, quote, eerie, Camejo said, but the loyalty was earned. It was Posadists' BLA that had created the party in the early 50s, and built them into a nationwide political power over the next decade. There was particular momentum in the country's northeast, where POR militant Paulo Roberto Pinto, Jeremias, was a main organizer of the Rural Workers' Union, a campesino movement dedicated to abolishing modern peonage through strikes and land occupation. In November of 1963, the union called a general strike that paralyzed the Pernambuco capital of Recife, with a work stoppage of 200,000 peasants and farmers. The events were so momentous that Posadists declared Brazil to be in a pre-revolutionary situation, inspiring Jeremias to replicate Posadists' Campesino Militia Council guerrilla strategy in Guatemala, with similar results. The arrival of armed struggle groups in Brazil was used as a pretext for the military to seize power from the center-left Goulart government in 1964. The anti-communist junta that replaced him stayed in power until the 80s, and the POR, identified as a guerrilla movement, was among their first targets. Jeremias was hunted down and murdered by paramilitary assassins almost immediately after the coup. Jeremias became the Posadist International's first martyr, honored with long obituaries in each newspaper, and the subject of a folk song performed at gatherings. The repression did not end with him, however. In the months that followed, many more Brazilian militants were rounded up, imprisoned, and tortured. Combined with the deepening repression in Central America, homages, obituaries, and prisoner solidarity campaigns began to overwhelm the Posadist press. Perhaps not coincidentally, the extreme loyalty noticed by Camejo began to disintegrate among younger militants. At the Fifth National Congress of the POR in 1965, one cadre distributed a document called Criticizing, Constructing, and Collectively Planning the Party. Although in full agreement with the party line, they worried its monolithic structure had become a defense mechanism for covering up theoretical and tactical shortcomings, and the prohibition on criticism was likened to, quote, feeding a monster. Posadists' quote, personal centralism, and insistence on grand world historic narratives, was isolating the party from local struggles, they said. They recommended publishing a paper that spoke in an adequate language to regular workers, tailored to each region of the large and diverse Brazilian landscape, especially the campesinos and those who made up the base of the Communist Party destabilized by the coup. They were swiftly expelled. A resolution published in the post-Congress edition of Frente Operaria called them a, quote, little group of adventurists and malcontents in the service of the police against the Fourth International, end quote. As if anticipating the response, they began to publish the proposed newspaper, and made sure to deliver it to their former comrades. As one defection led to another, the viral expansion of cadres, key to the international strategy, began to reverse, leading towards a particularly catastrophic split in the Brazilian section in 1968. By the early 70s, the Trotskyist movement in Brazil was led by ex-POR militants, still adhering to much of the BLA program, while no longer worshipping Posadists. The collapse of the Brazilian section, probably the most important in the International, was a model for dozens of smaller scandals initiated by internal critiques and ending in expulsions and splits spreading through every BLA section in the 60s. Almost every member who hadn't already been arrested quit the Mexican PORT out of disgust at the decisions that had led to the defeats in the region. In Uruguay, a militant couple left the party after Poseidus accused the wife of committing adultery and ordered them to release a self-criticism statement. In response, they produced a sarcastic flyer reading, quote, "Viva Poseidus, there's no one like Poseidus. Give to Poseidus, follow Poseidus, down with Poseidus." In Argentina, someone with access to Voz Proletaria's plates, likely an editor gone rogue, printed a fake issue mocking Poseidus's bizarre positions on the Cuban regime with a headline calling for Mao to overthrow Castro. Defections were comparatively rare and isolated in the small sections of Europe, where lower stakes kept most militants obedient as recent converts. Repercussions for dissent, however, were no less harsh. In one instance, a member of the Italian section quit with a polemic against Poseidus and Minazzoli's dogmatic allegiance to him. In response, Minazzoli ordered him killed. Unclear if he was serious, no one carried out the order. Others preferred to quietly back away, including important intellectuals such as Alberto J. Pla in Argentina and Boris Fausto in Brazil. For most of the intellectual core of GCI veterans and Poseidus's immediate family, however, defection was simply not an option. The International was not just one socialist group among many, but the only correct one, tracing its lineage back to the first International of Marx and Engels. Their task was equal parts philosophical and technical, like a machine that converts communist consciousness into social reality in order to produce a new world from raw material of the old. As production of new cadres slowed to a halt, they chose to blame the machine's components, the militant base of the movement, instead of themselves as engineers and operators. Worn out and defective gears were easily thrown away, creating a smaller machine they hoped would at least run more smoothly, and with fewer fatal accidents. In her memories of the PORT, the Argentine militant Joan Benavent used a different metaphor to describe the movement, a sui generis Marxist church. Poseidus was Pope, his secretariat the cardinals, and their congresses and reading groups secretive synods. All believed themselves to be the inheritors of a fundamental truth about the nature of reality that allowed them to interpret and advance the Marxist canon as they actualized a singular vision of communist heaven on earth. The way the Poseidus Church excommunicated the critical working class and student militants as heretics with, quote, emotional coldness, deepened the division between the idea of communism and the reality of the class struggle. This, she said, resulted in the bizarre positions and pronouncements the movement is known for today. In an interview with Revista Descubrir, Angel Fanjul recalled that their study groups around this time began to focus on the deepest scientific questions of Marxism. Quote, "We talked about the evolution of material," Fanjul said, referring to Anti-Dührung, Engels' critique of bourgeois ideology in the sciences that became foundational for the dialectical materialist scientific method. Quote, "About the evolution of protoplasm and movement while the universe was in formation." End quote. The subject, bizarre and obscure to most socialists, had been central to the debates between Bogdanov and Lenin's respective decentralized versus monolithic conceptions of the party. Published between 1904-6, Bogdanov's series of essays titled Empirio-Monism argued that the work of modern physicists had demonstrated reality to ultimately be a function of an intersubjective human consciousness. As a singular capitalist labor process spread across the globe, he believed workers would instinctively come to understand this social nature of reality and their ability to seize it for themselves. The party's role was to help them along through political action and mass education. Bogdanov's essays were largely forgotten, however, as a result of Lenin's harsh polemic against them, 1909's Materialism and Imperial Criticism. This became a central text of Poseidism, in which Lenin asserted that Bogdanov's philosophy was pure idealism, because nature was actually objective, material, and empirical, and best understood by an intellectual vanguard well versed in the Marxist scientific method of dialectical materialism. The task of the party was therefore not to follow the workers to revolutionary consciousness, but to guide them towards revolution and rule over them afterwards as dictators. As the rightful inheritors of Lenin and Trotsky's internationals, the Posedists believed themselves the authorities best equipped to tackle the mysteries of the universe left under-discussed during the tumult of the first half of the century. In a moment, Minnezzoli had been waiting for since the foundation of the GCI, when his teenage fandom for science fiction and cosmism were censored. He used this discussion of physics, evolution, and dialectics to return the extraterrestrial hypothesis to table. Since the belief that humans were the only intelligent life in the universe represents the same type of bourgeois idealism that holds capitalist class society as natural and the best of all possible worlds, he argued the Posedis International should recognize in the popularity of the UFOs a socialist impulse. The mass fascination with the phenomenon demonstrated a desire to reach the heights of our alien visitors, themselves likely here to help us. If a pro-extraterrestrial analysis were adapted to their program, the International would receive a new burst of support from the grassroots, if not from the cosmos. The subject finally came to a head at the 1967 World Congress. Although he had some support, much of the International Secretariat was exhausted by Minnezzoli's, quote, on-and-off rantings on this topic, as Dondero described them. Hector Menendez recalled, quote, "There was a break to stretch, to eat a sandwich, to have a coffee. In those days, there had been a news boom about unidentified flying objects. And then there were comrades who defended the existence of flying saucers, and others, like Almeida, who said, 'No, you're crazy. If a superior culture existed, they'd already have intervened.'" End quote. As the day came to a close, the Geloso's wheels turning, Posedis decided it was time to settle the debate. Quote, "Life can exist on other planets, in other solar systems, in other galaxies and universes," he announced. But what did this have to do with us? The question of energy was central, both in the sense of the exploitation of energy, quote, "existing in matter," and as the common force of the universe that guides the motion of celestial bodies and history. These were all the same thing, he implied, yet capitalism only understands what it can exploit and sell, living labor and fossil fuels. Beginning of long quote. The aliens, on the contrary, may be on the way to exploiting all the energy existing in matter. They can use all the energy that we still do not know how to employ on Earth and transform it into light. While we take X amount of time to get from one continent to another, they perhaps do it in half a second. The conception of life and the organization of matter are determined by all such things. This energy must contain a property and force infinitely superior to anything we know. We can conceive of a being which, just by raising its hand, can produce light, draw energy to it, push it away, and organize it. It is possible. End quote. Any species capable of interstellar travel would have long ago mastered this deeper understanding. NASA, on the other hand, was blinded by the capitalist conception of life on Earth only, quote, in the commercial sense of private property. This is why the Soviets had outperformed them in every way, he said, cryptically asserting they had recently discovered, quote, a ray infinitely faster than light. The aliens must also be socially advanced enough to have achieved the necessary unity as a species to develop interstellar travel. As proof, he alluded to stories of close encounters that revealed the aliens, quote, have no aggressive impulse. They have no need to kill in order to live. They come only to observe. End quote. The real threat posed by UFOs was revealing the capitalist system as backwards compared to the social and technological harmony of the aliens. Class society, poverty, and war would all be abolished by the abundance made possible by such unity, as would natural death and disaster. If elephants could live 260 years, he said, and perhaps thinking of tortoises, why not us? Quote, the organization of society could take on infinitely superior forms, without struggle and antagonisms. There is no reason for fighting. If beings on other planets saw us, they would say, astonished, "Oh, they are fighting over a car, shooting and killing each other." For them, death does not exist. Here it does. The notion of death, the extinction of matter or of cells, is not the same everywhere. End quote. While Posadas believed we must, quote, appeal to the beings on other planets, when they come here, to intervene and collaborate with Earth's inhabitants in suppressing poverty, he also cautioned against wasting time speculating about them. It was more important to first, quote, resolve the problems of humanity on Earth. Why dream of first contact while the worker states are already eradicating hunger and make incredible technological advances? From here, he transitioned entirely into terrestrial, political, economic questions. Far from the popular conception of turning the movement into a, quote, Trotskyist UFO cult, Dondero believed Posadas gave the speech to, quote, dampen Minazzoli's insistence on pushing the issue and close the matter once and for all. Perhaps not realizing how it would appear out of context, Posadas had his secretary prepare a transcript for publication nonetheless. A year later, the speech was published in some Posadas newspapers as the essay, quote, Flying Saucers, the Process of Matter and Energy, Science, the Revolutionary and Working Class Struggle, and the Socialist Future of Mankind, end quote. It quickly became the defining feature of Posadism among other Trotskyists, who already obsessively read the Posadas press to reassure themselves that they had chosen the correct sect. Until then, Posadism was so similar to most other Trotskyist groups, they had little ammunition to politically attack Posadas, as his cult of personality, abuse of militants, rapid anti-imperialism, paranoia, extreme zigzagging, and catastrophism were features more or less present in nearly every other tendency. Now that the Posadas had announced their belief in aliens, the Ragazzi, who chucked stones at the Italian local of the Posadas section in Rome, the Morenoites, still holding their grudge, and Laura's Bolivian POR could call their rivals extraterrestres. A far more caustic joke was the date of the Flying Saucers essay's publication, the spring of 1968. End section.